Hello, my name is Chandran Kukathas, and I'm the Dean of the School of Social Sciences at the Singapore Management University and also a Professor of Political Science. And I'm here today to lecture on the topic of justice. More specifically, I want to talk to you by presenting an argument against justice, and through this, a critique of contemporary political theory. Now, this may seem like a somewhat odd choice of topic. In fact, much of political theory in the contemporary West has been dominated by the subject of justice. And it seems like a natural enough thing to be in favor of something like justice. Why would one want to offer a critique of justice in contemporary political theory? So let me say at the outset that my purpose is not, obviously, to advocate injustice in any form. It's really a case of wanting to look more closely at, firstly, certain concepts and how they're deployed in theorizing about the world, and then, more importantly, to look at some particular theories of justice in order to say something about how a focus on justice sets us on the wrong path in thinking about various issues, sets us on the wrong path, in particular as political philosophers. So let me begin by just raising the question of what is the question of justice? Now, in contemporary political theory, there are numerous issues that have naturally arisen simply because of the concerns we have in the modern world. We have concerns, for example, about poverty. We have concerns about the way in which the goods or the resources of the world are distributed, both within our own societies and also more broadly internationally. We're concerned, as anyone paying attention to the news will have noticed, about past wrongs. We're concerned, for example, about the history of colonialism. We're concerned about the treatment of African Americans in the United States. We're concerned about issues of racism that dominate many countries, both in the West and elsewhere. Furthermore, we're concerned not just about the claims of the past, but we're concerned about the claims of future generations. We're concerned, for example, about the environment, concerned about how we should care about it, who should bear the burden, to what extent we should think about preserving our heritage or our resources for the use of further generations. Now, I don't want for a moment to deny that all of these things are, in fact, very important concerns. I don't want to suggest that we should not think about the impact of colonialism, what we might do now to address some of the wrongs or the ills that are the outcome of that long history. I'm not going to suggest that we should not care about racism, for example, or the impact that race has had on the lives of many people. Nor do I want to suggest that we should not care about future generations. It's clearly an important consideration. But what I want to bring into question is the way in which we try to address these issues or these problems through the language of justice. And what I want to suggest is that that language is not ideally suited to these concerns, and indeed that in some respects, focusing on these questions or considerations through the lens of justice distracts us in various ways. It leads us down the wrong path. In fact, I'm going to claim that we've totally inflamed the whole notion of justice in a way that's unhelpful. So in order to do this, I want to start by saying a little bit about the theorist who is the most influential proponent of justice in certainly in the 20th century, but perhaps even leading into the 21st century, since even now, I think contemporary political theory in the liberal democratic West is dominated by his thought. And this is the political philosopher John Rawls. Rawls, as many of you may already know, wrote a very famous book which came out in 1971 called A Theory of Justice. And in this work, he proclaimed at the very outset that justice was the first virtue of social institutions, as truth was to systems of thought. Any system, no matter how well organized, must be reformed or abolished if it was not just. Justice was the first virtue. Now, in saying this, he was trying to propose an alternative to other ways of thinking about our obligations and our duties, and about the courses of action that we should pursue, both individually and, more importantly, institutionally. He wanted to challenge the idea, for example, that we should be guided by the thinking of, for example, utilitarians, who took the view that the most important thing was to make sure that we somehow maximize happiness or well-being, or in the language of the doctrine, utility. What Rawls wanted to suggest was that thinking about important ethical issues through the language of, say, welfare or efficiency was at best unacceptable. At worst, it was, in fact, simply morally wrong. What we needed to think about, the concepts through which we need to think about right and wrong, were above all concepts related to the idea of justice and just institutions. So what he wanted to present was an explanation of why we should take justice so seriously, and then secondly, to explain why it was that a proper understanding of justice would lead us to construct institutions of a certain kind, and institutions that would overall give special protection to ideals of freedom and equality and important consideration to human welfare. But in all of this, it would put justice at the forefront. It would ensure that under no circumstances could any course of action be justified if it did not conform to the ideal of justice. Justice was the first virtue, and justice was uncompromising. Now, so powerful and influential was Rawls's view that over the next 30 to 40 years, the discourse of contemporary political theory, the liberal democratic West, and perhaps even further abroad than this, came to be dominated by this idea that justice was the first virtue. Of course, there were dissenting voices, but for the most part, justice became the touchstone. As an illustration of this, consider, for example, very significant contemporary political thinker, Michael Sandel, who wrote a book in 1981 called Liberalism and the Limits of Justice, criticizing Rawls for putting justice at the center of ethical reflection, arguing himself that there were other ideals that this marginalized, the ideal, for example, of a political community or community more generally. And yet, 40 years later, Sandel himself published a book putting justice at the center of ethical reflection, became famous for his own lectures on justice, in which he addressed a whole range of issues through the lens of justice. In this past 40 years, we've therefore seen a veritable mushrooming, like, of theories of justice. We have Rawls's theory of justice as fairness. We have work of Brian Barry in his book, Justice as Impartiality. We've had defenses of justice understood in terms of equality, justice in terms of even-handedness. We've had numerous books published, all defending different conceptions of justice. The response to Rawls's theory, even among critics, was to try to imagine a better account of justice or a better theory of justice, rather than to try to address the very question of whether justice should be at the center of our thinking, at the center of ethical reflection. So we've had, I think, over the last 40 years, not only an expansion of the discussion of justice within critical theory or critical philosophy, we've also seen concern about justice expand into other areas of social inquiry. So now it's not unusual, for example, to see works on justice in healthcare. We've seen works on justice in dentistry. We've seen books on justice in playground design. More broadly speaking, we address issues, for example, of language justice, of climate justice, sex selection justice, of literacy justice. So many things that are not, needless to say, important concerns have become issues of justice. This is why I've suggested that what we're seeing is something I've called justicitis, that is to say, the inflammation of justice. I think in medical parlance, the suffix itis means inflammation. Well, justicitis is the inflammation of justice in two different ways. Firstly, everything seems to have become a matter of justice, so that so many questions, which may be important ethical considerations, become not just a matter of finding out whether a particular kind of outcome is valuable or desirable, becomes a matter of asking whether or not this is a matter of justice. But in a different sense, justice has been inflamed because the way in which theory has developed, justice has become something that's been inflamed conceptually. Theories of justice have developed in such a way as to include within them not just concerns about whether or not people were being treated rightly, but to include concerns about a range of other things, whether it be, for example, equality, whether it concerns claims of freedom, whether it concerns claims of other forms of distribution. So much has been built into the concept of justice in order to develop, as theories of justice, full accounts of how society's concerns overall should be managed, how different values should be understood in relation to the single overarching consideration. The concept of justice grows fat in this sense. And the difficulty we have in this development is that if justice or an account of justice includes so many other considerations, it becomes difficult to ask, for example, whether there is a tension or a conflict between the ideal of justice and other ideals. If justice, for example, embraces both concerns about freedom and equality on the one hand, and concerns about, say, for example, the protection of diversity or the concern for other important values such as piety or religion, then it becomes very difficult to understand how it is that justice is the overriding consideration rather than, say, some other concern that turns out to be, in many other languages of ethics, something that's in tension with justice. Is justice really something that should be seen as a concept that subsumes everything else, so that we look at all of our other ethical concerns under the rubric of justice, discuss them under this particular aspect. Now, if I'm going to present you with a critique of this kind, the obvious question to ask then is, well, how should one think about justice? And I think that's a legitimate consideration. So let me take a step back to say a little bit about how one should understand the concept of justice. And I want to do this by taking what may seem like a more sociological account, but I think it's really an account that gives us a conceptual understanding of justice, which will give us the basis from which to see why it is that I want to make the critique that this lecture is about. So let me do this by turning to a thinker who was extremely influential in the thinking of John Rawls himself. And this is the Scottish philosopher, David Hume. Hume wrote very important work in the 18th century called A Treatise of Human Nature, part 3 of which dealt with morality. And at the center of his account of morality here was his account of justice. Now, what's interesting about Hume's account of justice is that what he tries to do is offer an account of the place of justice in human life and in human society, so that we could understand its importance for understanding society and social relations, but at the same time does not go on to offer what we might in contemporary terms think of as a theory of justice. I hope what I'm trying to get at will be clear by the end of my account, but let me begin then by saying something about Hume's account of justice. Hume argues in this his account of justice in the Treatise of Human Nature, but also in his other works, Hume suggests that justice is something that arises simultaneously with the emergence of society. It is not possible to imagine a society without justice. And by this, what he means are rules of association. Rules of justice are nothing more than that. They're rules of association, which are fundamental in order for people to negotiate their relations with each other as individual human beings relating to one another directly, but also for their relating to one another indirectly because of the fact that they exist in an external world in which they have relation to that world as well, in which they have a relation to the material dimension of the world. That relation Hume calls the relationship of property. These three things come into existence simultaneously: justice, society, and property. You cannot have human association without all three of these things existing simultaneously. Human society is a relationship of individuals with one another in a material world in which they have to occupy, consume, and manage the external world. Because of this, it is impossible for human beings to survive and flourish unless the rules of justice are in place, unless there are some rules of justice. That is to say, unless there are norms that govern and guide them in trying to understand how they should relate to one another. And they can only relate to one another in this material world, in a world in which there are clear understandings about how parts of the world will be managed or used or exchanged. But what is critical in Hume's account of this is that he does not say very much, if anything at all, about the content of these rules of justice. All he says is that we have to have rules of justice. In fact, it's hard to imagine our not having rules of justice. That is to say, rules of association, rules which tell us, in effect, what is and what is not permitted with respect to the external world. Now, there are certain things that are important if these rules are to function effectively. They have to be consistent, they have to be understood, they have to be accepted. And he suggests there are a few obvious norms that will come into effect, particularly with regard to the external world. The stability of possession, for example, will become very important. People will have to know that their possessions can't simply be taken from them without their knowledge or consent. There have to be rules for the transferring of property from one person to another. There would have to be institutions that settled disputes when people disagreed about questions. All of these things are fundamental. But there is no account in Hume of, for example, what is the correct way of distributing the property that exists. There are no theories offered by him about what are the best ways, or the right ways, the just ways, if you like, of distributing the goods to be found in the world. There are no theories in any of these writings about what kinds of entitlements people are able to claim as a matter of right within these rules of justice. Hume gives us an account of justice in the sense that he gives us an account of why it's important to have stable rules for the distribution of the goods of the material world and for governing the relations between people, but he does not give us an account of what those rules should be. He does not tell us what rules of justice are in fact just. Now, this is not, I think, because Hume thought that any old rules will do. It's clear that some rules would work better than others. Some rules might be more likely to cause confusion. Other rules may be more likely to be seen as incomprehensible or simply unfair in some way. In all of this, some consideration should surely be given to the kinds of rules we should have. But most importantly of all, Hume suggests what we need is a stable system of rules. This is what justice is. It's a stable system of rules.